I read a lot in the anthropology space. One of my favorite books recently was *Sapiens*, which
I read
is
excerpts from it, but I haven't read the whole book.
it's an undertaking, and you're going to get it in classes. But it's interesting. Anthropology, which is the study of humanity, correct?
Yeah,
Would
pretty
you
much.
would you
Yeah, I mean the easiest way to describe it is sociology without the numbers.
Okay, but it's about humans and human interaction with the world.
Big time.
And so artificial intelligence, which is not human, and you actually earlier used the word synthetic material when relating not to the plastic in my glasses, but to the product, the results and proceeds of the use of the AI. That is also synthetic materials, even though it's intangible, technically.
That's a lovely comparison there, talking about it, thinking of it as organic versus synthetic materials.
But they're synthetic, but we're talking about generative AI, but we could go further with artificial intelligence and programmed non-human things. But let's not go in that direction. That's a little too sci-fi for this.
We gotta stay on the policy.
but if we stay on the policy, in Massachusetts, part of their legislative approach includes requiring companies that are using artificial intelligence to process data or otherwise, interact with or process data. Let's just leave it at that. To register with the Attorney General and be public about it. It'll be a public registry. What role does humanity have? And it's a big question. What role does humanity have in managing the relationship and use of artificial intelligence?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think to me, something that I've really realized recently is that I just don't think that legislation and regulation will move at the pace of development, especially in AI. I was reading a text in one of my art history classes that was talking about how art historians are always building walls behind the current movements of art. And I think that's pretty much how it's going to play out with enforced legislation. With AI is things are developing so quickly that, especially with the politics of it all, I don't foresee it being possible to realistically regulate, at least in terms of specifics, properly when it comes to AI and especially generative AI models. And so that's something I think is kind of crazy. But I don't know how I feel about voluntary agreements because, in the end, they're voluntary. And big companies will do what's in the big company's best interests a lot of the time, despite the fact that, we've seen all of these leaders of these AI companies calling for legislation and for regulation.
Do you think that they're calling for legislation and regulation so that it takes the pressure off of them to have to come up with voluntary procedures and policies? And because the process for getting legislation and regulations is so complicated, it gives them a longer runway?
I think I think both parts of that are absolutely true. They don't want to have to regulate themselves and I guess define these moral standards for themselves, even though they are the ones who understand this issue the most intricately. But, also with the length of the process, it gives them more leeway to develop before these things come out.
It's so interesting to me, when we talked that first time about possibility of you doing this project and being interested, I was like, I can't learn this again. I've been through this because I was part of the beginning of the internet. And I kid you not, one night I walked into someone's house, they were having a party, and they had a whole hard drive, which I'm not sure you've ever seen what one looks like, but they had a whole hard drive dedicated to Napster, to music that they had downloaded. And
Mhm.
I got so upset. I've been practicing law for all of 3.5 years, but I came to copyright because of artist rights. I unplugged the server. Like I unplugged it from the wall, and I was so bad, so bad. But when I was dealing in the copyright issues back in the 2000s, it was a game of catch up. It was a game of like trying to catch up to the technology. And what developed during that period was something called the permissionless era. Caroline, do you remember this?
I don't remember that. I remember all the Creative Commons and all that licensing
Yes,
stuff.
the licensing. But basically what happened was it became very common for a wide range of what we call tech companies. There's some of them, are they really tech? To move forward with their ideas without asking permission and ask forgiveness later. Great examples of that are Uber and Airbnb. But there's so many examples of that from that period. What do you, I don't get the sense that there is I'm not so sure that even venture capital firms and other people really understand the power of generative AI or artificial intelligence in general. When you were interacting with not just the laws, but the other research around this, what did you get the sense? Did you feel like there was like some common understanding?
I think that the most common understanding is the one that's inaccessible to, the layperson, is the people who are actually working on these issues, like who are working in these companies and, coding and directly overseeing AI, have the best understanding. And that's not the understanding that I think is reflected in attempts to legislate. I think people are absolutely playing a game of catch up. And I think probably will continue to, when it comes to understanding, what artificial intelligence means, what deep learning is, what, generative AI is, as well as just the general pervasiveness of artificial intelligence systems in our day-to-day lives and in pretty much everything we interact with at this point, especially if it's on the internet. And I think that that's something that people are starting to inch towards, but I think that we're far from at a shared understanding there.
I mean, I would say it applies to most internet things, most computer things, right? Because there's you use these tools, but you don't necessarily understand how they work. And so until we, really break it down, and I have small children, so they're doing all the coding in schools things to start early with helping them develop that algorithmic thinking that is required to be able to even understand how computers, much less some advanced software like AI, works.
Yeah, that was something I was actually happy to see in one of the bills I was looking at that's proposed. Is New York is proposing required digital literacy education. And I think it's pretty necessary for this world. But I think also when it comes to shared understanding, something that I've seen a bit in some of the legislation I looked at is forced disclosure and making it accessible when it comes to people, I guess, general users of services that employ AI, to understand, not only what their data is being used for, but how the AI works, at least in a, pretty surface level breakdown. It's something that I know I personally would love to see more, because I know everyone's faced with when it comes to data management, everyone's just faced with opening a website. Hey, can we use your cookies? And if you try and opt out or try and reduce what's collected, it takes you to 1 million different pages that you have to navigate with more time than you and thought that you might want to put in. And I think especially as AI systems are starting to collect more and more data in a more nebulous way, I think those kinds of agreements and those kinds of forced public, interactions are going to be a lot more necessary.
I agree. I like the idea of digital literacy training, especially around something like AI, because when you don't know how it works, you don't know what you even should be opting out of. So you have to have kind of a basic understanding of how it works. And, for example, we're talking in a law firm here, right? So if we used AI on any of our client material, we are likely to run into confidentiality issues unless we are using the AI appropriately, not allowing client data to be used to train the model, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we didn't have an understanding of how AI worked and our specific AI and how it was implemented, then we could very quickly run into ethics violations.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So it's funny, because it's true. When I started practicing, email was still not the most common way to send documents back and forth, and bandwidth wasn't that big. I'm not even sure. Can't remember when Adobe started PDFs. I remember when Adobe did start, and they were the only PDF option. It was very expensive, and a lot of people didn't have it. And so when you did start sending files back and forth, some of us were aware to make sure that track changes were completely turned off. But then sometimes they weren't, other people weren't. And I often had some real opportunities in negotiations because I could see where changes had been made. So I knew what I could ask for. Like I had a better, like, oh, they changed this from 25,000 to 15,000. So I'm going to go back and ask for 25 or more. And I think what Caroline just said, and what you were just saying about literacy, is that not everybody's going to have that literacy. Even we've been dealing with the digital divide since the beginning of computers. So that's a little sort of concerning to me that we put some responsibility. We're putting some responsibility on the user and also the UZ. So I come back to my question about, I used to be a big fan of the social contract, but now I look at the social contract and I think about all the bias and other issues that are built into the social contract, especially the social contract that keeps the United States together. But any social contract that there are biases that get built in.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that and I don't think of it, it was interesting earlier you said the moral issue. I don't think of it as morality. I think of it as a duty to our humankind. I think some of this responsibility falls on the people building AI.
Absolutely.
And do you think that can be legislated?
That's a great question. I personally don't really know. I think that, I've said it already. I just think that we're going to continue to be, trailing behind development. And, these, I think the best you're going to get when you're trying to act ahead is any kind of voluntary code. Maybe we can come up with, it seems like there are some ideas of general principles as guidelines that can guide development in a more ethical manner. But, I don't think that you can just, be like, oh, here's this really broad blanket statement, follow it. That's not a model for legislation, nor is it a model for actual enforcement. And so, I'm not quite sure about how we're going to actually deal with that.
I think that's such a great idea. General principles of understanding of how to use and build AI. Which
it's something I'd really like to see. And I think it seems like it's something that we're moving towards, but I don't know what it will actually look like.
That's so interesting. Caroline earlier mentioned the Creative Commons, which was developed as a copyleft movement to create means for copyright rights holders, for copyright owners, to be able to license their materials that are protected by copyright in a variety of ways that were easy to use and easy to understand, even though there's some gotchas in them. Like copyright CC by attribution doesn't mean that you can use it commercially and things like that.
No.
I wonder, and this would be an interesting thing to look at, if there are any efforts to, as there were with the copyleft movement back in the 2000s, to come up with these general principles of understanding and how to use it. So that would be interesting to look at, because that does seem like, as much as I like to complain about the copyleft, they actually used much of the same language that you did when I would argue for copyright protection for things. That my maximalist approach to copyright doesn't work on the internet.
Mhm. I think what's good with copyright in particular is it seems that the US Copyright Office honestly is on track to come up with some kind of, general applicable idea of copyright eligibility for AI and for AI, assisted, I guess, generation. That, I mean, of course, is going to be challenged and already has been challenged. But I think that at least copyright issues with AI seem to be starting to figure themselves out. But I think that ethical regulation is definitely a big, big question.
I'm following quite a few cases regarding the use of copyright protected works to train AI without permission from or compensation to the original owners, which is very similar to the issues back at the beginning of Napster. And one of the groups that lost out pretty big to the internet were photographers.
Mhm.
Photographers were hit with a double whammy of, in 1988, it was the Berne Convention was finally enacted in the United States, which had been actually adopted in 1899. And the United States was party to this international process to come up with this treaty that took away all formalities for copyright protection. But the United States was, I don't know, I don't think we were the last country, but we were one of the last in 1988 to enact it. And all of a sudden in 1988, you no longer had to have the copyright in the circle and your name on the image to get copyright protection. And so in 1988, everything goes off. You don't have to have that on there. And it wasn't 1994, which was the beginning of the commercial internet, was only 6 years later. And so by the time, and because of bandwidth issues, photographs were one of the easiest things to use or to upload and to transmit over the internet. And the reason that I'm bringing that up is authors are the ones leading the effort now with much of this legislation. I mean, much of this litigation, because their books were so easy to scan because Google Books started the scanning thing. So it's just interesting to see the similarities between the beginning of the copyright, and we know the damage that was done to the creative classes, for people that argue with me on that. So it'll be interesting to see how we can protect the creative classes with AI.